Imagine this. You are standing barefoot on a warm Mesopotamian night, 4,500 years ago. The air smells of river mud and burning cedar. Above you, the sky is a black bowl pierced by 1,000,000 cold stars. And somewhere in that darkness, a red wanderer, the ancients called Nibiru, is sliding closer, unseen by modern telescopes, yet remembered in every nightmare we ever had about the end of the world. Tonight we return to the cradle of our species, to the moment when gods walked the earth like tyrants, and the first cities rose from the dust on the backs of a people who were never meant to be free. Tonight we ask the question that still keeps scholars awake and conspiracy theorists feverish. What if everything we call civilization is not our invention, but their inheritance? And what if the proof is already carved in stone, waiting for the one secret that will only be whispered in the final minute of this journey? The year is 1853. A low moon bleeds silver across the Iraqi desert south of Baghdad, turning the Euphrates into a blade of black glass. A Bedouin shepherd, Hanan, barefoot and wrapped in rags, has let his sheep wander while he climbs a strange mound the locals avoid after dusk. They call it Tel Alam, Hill of Meat, because every spring the wind flays the sand and the ground weeps red pottery like fresh wounds. Tonight, the mound is restless. A warm wind moves over it, the way breath moves over embers. Hanan digs his staff into the slope and feels the earth sigh, a slow exhalation held for 4,000 years. He kneels, scrapes with cracked fingers, and strikes something smooth and deliberate. A corner of baked clay. He works faster, heart suddenly loud in his ears. More fragments appear, then an edge, then an entire tablet the size of a prayer rug, its face crowded with tiny wedge marks that look like frantic bird tracks across wet mud. He lifts it into moonlight. The signs catch the glow and, for one heartbeat, shimmer as if remembering the kiln that birthed them. Hanan has never seen writing, has never held a book, but the tablet is warm, warmer than the night, and heavy with something that watches back. He whispers the old prayer against jinn, yet cannot let go. In his calloused thumb's tracing, the wedges rearrange themselves like stars sliding into a forbidden pattern. He does not know he cradles a fragment of the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian song of creation itself. How the heavens were split from chaos, how gods were born screaming, and how, much later, those gods would shape mankind from clay and divine blood for reasons colder than any desert night. Far away, a young Englishman named Rawlinson will one day ride here because an Ottoman governor mutters about a shepherd and a stone that speaks. Silver coins will change hands, and the tablet will sail to London. But tonight, it belongs only to Hanan and the moon. He sits cross-legged on the breathing hill, sheep forgotten, while above him, a faint red star, the ancients once tracked with terror glimmers on the horizon for the first time in centuries. The sky remembers what we buried, and it is about to speak again, one broken piece of clay at a time. 4,000 years before Hanan lifted that glowing tablet, another man stands on a wall and feels the same night pressing against his skin. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, 2/3 divine, 1/3 trembling mortal, climbs the highest tower of his city just before dawn. The air is thick with the smell of baked brick and distant cedar smoke. Below him, Uruk sleeps under a blanket of torchlight. 6 square kilometers of humanity packed tighter than any settlement the world has ever known. A restless heartbeat of 80,000 souls who still whisper that their king is more than human. He is barefoot tonight, the royal sandals kicked aside. The mud brick parapet is warm from yesterday's sun, and he presses his palms against it as though he could push the coming sunrise back into the underworld. His chest rises and falls too quickly. A month ago, Enkidu was alive, laughing, wrestling lions for sport, drinking beer from bowls the size of helmets. Now Enkidu is ash and memory, and the same fever that ate his friend is already licking at the edges of Gilgamesh's dreams. He looks east, where the horizon bleeds the first sickly green. Somewhere beyond those marshes, beyond the Cedar Mountains, beyond even the edge of the world, there is rumored to be one man who outran death. One man who was lifted above the fate the gods wrote for the rest of us. Gilgamesh's knuckles whiten on the brick. He is stronger than any 10 mortals, faster, more beautiful, more cruel, more everything. Yet the same small darkness waits inside his ribs. The same small darkness that waits inside yours, listening to this story in the quiet hours before sleep. He remembers Enkidu's last night, the wasting body, the eyes already looking past the living world, the cracked voice whispering, "I am afraid, brother." Gilgamesh had raged then, torn the palace hangings, beaten the priests until blood ran from their ears, demanding they bring his friend back. They only bowed lower and repeated the same sentence that now rings in his skull like a death knell. The gods have spoken. One of you had to pay. Pay, as though life were a debt, and death the collector who never forgets an address. Gilgamesh leans out over the parapet until the wind claws his hair. Far below, the great gate stands open for the night caravans. He could walk through it right now, leave the crown on the steps, trade purple robes for animal skins, and run until the sun itself grows tired of chasing him. Somewhere there must be an answer. Somewhere there must be a door death forgot to lock. He does not cry. Kings do not cry. Instead, he presses his forehead to the warm brick and whispers the question that will outlive every wall he ever built, every enemy he ever crushed, every lover he ever frightened. The question that will be scratched into wet clay 1,000 years after his bones are dust. The first written scream of our species. Why must I die when I was born to be eternal? The wind carries the words away toward the waking river. And somewhere, in a future none of us can yet imagine, a shepherd on a moonlit hill will lift a piece of that scream from the ground. Still warm, still unanswered. Gilgamesh's question did not vanish with the dawn. It sank into the city's bones, into the ledgers of the scribes who sat in reed-shaded courtyards counting barley, beer, and human days. Every evening, when the sun bled itself across the river, a priest scribe dipped his stylus into black ink and added another line to the longest list humanity has ever dared to keep. The Sumerian king list. Imagine the tablet in your hand, still damp from the river clay, its columns as neat as soldiers. The names begin innocently enough. Alulim, Alalangar, kings of Eridu, the first city the gods ever loved. Then, the numbers arrive like thunder that forgets to stop. Alulim reigned 28,800 years. Alalangar, 36,000. 8 kings, 10 kings, 20, each granted reigns that swallow entire ice ages. Together they rule for 241 Hasdas 200 years. Longer than Homo sapiens has even existed, according to every textbook you ever trusted. The scribes never blink. They never cross out a digit, never add the word myth. They write as calmly as accountants tallying grain, because to them this is the same work, recording what was. The list flows on, city after city, dynasty after dynasty, until one line drops like a blade. Then the flood swept over. 4 words. No drama, no thunder, just the quiet stroke that ends the world. And then, almost shyly, history begins again. The first king after the flood is Jushur of Kish. And suddenly the numbers shrink to something a human heart can hold. 200 years, 800, 600. Still impossibly long, yet shrinking with every generation, as if the deluge washed away not only cities but centuries themselves. By the time we reach the dynasty of Uruk, the reigns have collapsed into the merely heroic. In Merkar, 420 years, Lugobanda, 1,200. And then, in the same unemotional column, the name we have been chasing across 4 millennia, Gilgamesh, son of Lugobanda, whose reign was 126 years. 126. A lifespan still absurd by our standards, yet suddenly, achingly mortal beside the tens of thousands that came before. The scribes treat it with the same calm ink they used for the antediluvian titans, as though 28,800 and 126 are simply 2 different kinds of fact. We stand at that line the way a child stands at the edge of a swimming pool, staring into water so deep the bottom has forgotten the sun. On one side, impossible eons, kings who measured their rule by the slow turning of constellations. On the other, Gilgamesh, close enough to touch, close enough to bleed. The list refuses to choose between them. It marries them in the same breath, the way a dream marries memory. And somewhere in that marriage is the fracture we still live inside. Before the flood, time was a god's toy. After the flood, time became a human wound. The king list is the scar where those 2 worlds were sewn together with a reed stylus, and the thread is still pulling. Gilgamesh felt it pulling the night he stood on the wall. He felt the 200 years leaning over his shoulder like a shadow cast by something enormous that had not yet finished walking away. He felt the 126 years tightening around his throat, like a noose made of ordinary sunrises. The scribes, bless their obsessive hearts, simply wrote it all down and handed the tablet to the next generation, the way a dying man hands his terrified son the keys to a house that is already on fire. Years after Gilgamesh vanished into the wilderness, chasing a rumor of immortality, the city he left behind kept breathing. Temples cracked, canals silted, and every generation needed to prove it still belonged to the gods. In the holy district of Nippur, the great sanctuary of Enlil, one particular building, the Tumul, the exalted mound, kept falling into ruin and being rebuilt like a promise that refused to die. The priests kept meticulous records. Who paid for the bricks? Who supplied the bitumen? Who carried the baskets of earth? One of those records, scratched onto a thick clay prism around 1800 BCE, is so dull it should have crumbled to dust with boredom. It lists kings the way a quartermaster lists onions. Aga of Kish rebuilt the Tumul. Meskiagnuna of Uruk rebuilt the Tumul. Then, in the same flat bureaucratic voice, It drops the sentence that still makes archaeologists catch their breath. Gilgamesh, son of Lugalbanda, built the wall of the Tumul and the wall of Nippur. No thunder, no fanfare. Just a construction receipt, the ancient equivalent of a yellowed invoice tucked behind a radiator. Gilgamesh and his son Ur-Nungal, yes, the same boy the epic mentions only in passing, personally financed and supervised the repair of Enlil's favorite shrine. They hauled bitumen, baked bricks, paid the corvée laborers in bread and beer, then signed the bottom of the ledger like any other mortal contractor. Imagine this scene. The same man who once wrestled Enkidu in the streets, who cut down the cedar forest and laughed at goddesses, now stands in the dust of Nippur with a clay tablet and a stylus, arguing with a priest about the price of reeds. The same hands that once held the dying Enkidu now smear wet clay across a prism, pressing his seal ring into the corner the way a modern CEO initials an expense report. The gods are watching, the scribes are watching, and Gilgamesh, terrified of death, allergic to obscurity, is making sure his name will be read aloud every time some future priest recites the repairs. And it worked. 3,500 years later, when German excavators pulled that prism from the ruins in 1896, the name was still perfectly legible, still defiant. The ink had become the clay itself. Gilgamesh had signed his mortality in the one medium that outlasts flesh. Bureaucracy. That single line is a scalpel. It slices straight through the haze of legend and touches warm skin. The epic can call him 2/3 divine, all it likes. The Tumul invoice reminds us that the other third was a man who paid his bills, worried about flood damage, and wanted posterity to know he showed up with the bricks when the gods asked. The tyrant who once exhausted Uruk with forced labor became, centuries later, the benefactor who rebuilt a neighbor city's holiest shrine. The grief-stricken runner who fled his throne came home long enough to leave a paper trail. Somewhere in the underworld, Enkidu must have smiled. His wild brother, who feared being forgotten more than dying, ensured his memory the ways only kings can, with a building project and a receipt. The walls of the Tumul are gone, but the invoice remains quietly insisting, in the driest language known to man, that Gilgamesh was here, flesh, blood, ego, and all. Walk south from Nippur along the ancient course of the Euphrates, and the horizon begins to rise before you do. A wall appears, not the gentle slope of a hill, but a manufactured cliff of pale, sun-bleached brick, 9 kilometers long, 15 meters high, studded with 900 semicircular towers like the teeth of some sleeping leviathan. This is Uruk, the city that should never have been. 5,200 years ago, the plain was empty except for reed huts and goat pens. Then, in the span of 2 or 3 generations, less time than separates us from Shakespeare, everything detonated. 6 square kilometers of planned streets, canals, and courtyards erupted from the mud. 80,000 people poured in, more than lived on the entire planet a century earlier. They baked millions of bricks in kilns that ran day and night, laid them in perfect courses, and raised a city so large it would not be matched again until Imperial Rome. Inside those walls, the air hummed. Workshops clattered with the first mass-produced objects on Earth. Crude, bevel-rimmed bowls, stamped out by the tens of thousands, to feed an army of workers who never went home. Accountants invented writing because they could no longer remember who owed how many jars of beer. Temples grew until the Iana district alone was a city within the city, its platforms rising in colored terraces toward a sky that now belonged to Inanna, goddess of love and war, who had chosen Uruk as her playground and her throne. Stand on the great wall at sunset, and you can almost see the explosion frozen in time. The grid of streets laid out with ropes and plumb lines, the white temple gleaming atop its ziggurat like a second moon. The smoke of 1,000 bread ovens drifting over rooftops packed so tight, a cat could walk from one side of Uruk to the other without touching ground. And everywhere the footprints of one man's obsession. Gilgamesh, who looked at an empty plain and decided mortality would have to wait until the city was finished. Uruk was not built. It was willed into being, a single act of defiance against the smallness of human life. The walls still stand in places, burned reddish by later fires, staring across the desert like a dare. They say to every later empire, "We did it first, we did it bigger, and we did it while the rest of you were still learning how to plant barley." Gilgamesh is gone, but the city he forced out of nothing keeps his heartbeat. Loud, impossible, and still refusing to die. Walk down any street in Uruk at dawn, and the sound is the same. A hollow, wet slap of clay against clay. In long open sheds along the inner wall, rows of silent women and children hunch over wooden molds, pressing fistfuls of river mud into the same crude, beveled rim shape, again and again, faster than heartbeats. They never look up. They never vary the angle. By noon, the kilns glow red and swallow yesterday's bowls by the thousands, exhaling smoke that smells of scorched grain and obedience. These bowls are ugly, thick-rimmed, mass-produced to the point of insult. Tens of thousands have been found, some still stacked in perfect columns inside collapsed storehouses, waiting for rations that never came. Archaeologists call them the first industrial product in history. But the people who ate from them had a simpler name: the king's mouthful. Each one held exactly one portion of barley porridge or beer-thick soup, doled out at sunset to the laborers who dragged mud bricks up ramps, who dug the canals that fed the city, who raised temples so high the priests could almost touch the stars. No one signed their work. No artisan carved his name on the rim. The bowls were anonymous, the way a whip is anonymous. Tools of a system that needed bodies more than it needed faces. Yet they speak louder than any statue. Their very sameness is the fingerprint of a state that had learned to count its people the way it counted sheep, by the bowlful. Imagine the line at dusk. Thousands of sunburnt arms reaching out, palm up, receiving the identical vessel, identical portion, identical tomorrow. No one asks why the walls keep growing higher, why the temples keep swallowing grain, why the king's name is carved on every gate while theirs is carved on nothing. The bowl is the answer. Because someone decided the city was more important than any single life inside it. And the bowl was the contract, renewed every evening, sealed in wet clay and fire. Gilgamesh never touched one of these bowls. Kings drank from silver. But he understood their language perfectly. Every identical rim was a heartbeat mortgage to his dream. Every cracked shard now lying in the sand is a receipt for the bargain our species made the day we traded freedom for walls. And somewhere in that endless line of outstretched hands was the ghost of every worker who ever built a civilization on an empty stomach still waiting for the bowl that will finally be filled with something more than barley and obedience. Stand on the highest surviving bastion at twilight, and you can still trace the entire circuit with your eyes. 10 kilometers of kiln-fired brick, pale as bone in the dying light, rising and falling over the plain like the back of a sleeping dragon. 900 semicircular towers jut outward every 11 meters, precise as drum beats. From the air, it must have looked like a perfect fingerprint pressed into the desert. The first time power ever wrote its name in geometry so large that even the gods had to squint to read it. Gilgamesh begins and ends his own epic with these walls. The very first lines command the listener. Go up onto the wall of Uruk and walk around. See the foundation terrace, examine the brickwork. He is not boasting about gold or palaces. He is boasting about defense, about permanence, about a line drawn in. Fire-hardened clay that says to every rival, every storm, every century, you stop here. They built them 6 meters thick at the base, wide enough for 2 chariots to pass abreast on the parapet. The bricks were stamped with the royal seal before firing. Millions of them, each one a tiny oath of loyalty baked at 800 degrees. When the kilns cooled, the walls rose so fast that travelers arriving a year apart swore the city had grown overnight. Enemies saw them from 3 days' march and turned back without a fight. The walls were not just defense. They were propaganda you could walk on. Gilgamesh climbed them the night Enkidu died. He paced the entire circuit alone, barefoot, pressing his palms to the warm bricks as if feeling for a pulse. Somewhere along the northern stretch, he stopped and looked out over the dark plain where the cedar forest waited, where death waited, where everything waited that could not be kept out by any wall ever built. The towers stood silent, useless against the one enemy they were never designed to repel. Tonight, 5,000 years later, the wind still moves along the broken crest, whistling through gaps where bricks have fallen. The towers are stumps, the gates are sand, yet the line remains, stubborn, ridiculous, magnificent. You can follow it for kilometers before it dissolves into wheat fields and irrigation ditches. And if you listen closely in the dark, you can almost hear the king's voice carried on that wind, the same voice that opens the oldest story we possess. See what I made to outlast me. He was wrong, of course. The walls outlasted him, outlasted Uruk, outlasted every empire that ever measured itself against them. But the question he asked on their summit, "Why must I die?" is still walking the parapet tonight, barefoot and restless, looking for a gate that death forgot to close. Years after Gilgamesh's walls crumbled into their own footprints, other kings rose and fell, and the libraries of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh and the scribal schools of Nippur grew fat with tablets. Shelves of sun-dried clay lined cool corridors. Contracts, hymns, star charts, and the 11, later 12 tablets that carried Gilgamesh's grief across the centuries. They were never meant to last. Sun-dried clay is soft, a careless elbow, a spilled jar of oil, a child's foot, and the words would smear back into mud. Then, in 612 BCE, the armies of Babylon and Media breached Nineveh's walls. They put the palace to the torch. Cedar beams a cubit thick roared into the night, collapsing roofs, crushing furniture, turning corridors into furnaces. Heat surged through the library. The flames that were meant to erase memory did the opposite. They fired 25,000 tablets at 900 degrees, for hours, longer than any kilnmaster would dare. The soft clay hissed, cracked, and hardened into terracotta as unbreakable as pottery. When the smoke cleared and the looters picked through the ashes, they kicked aside what looked like broken bricks. They never noticed that each shard carried tiny wedge-shaped scars, stories, laws, laments, now fused forever into ceramic. The fire that destroyed an empire accidentally saved its voice. Centuries later, when Austin Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam dug into the ruined palace mound at Kuyunjik, they found corridors paved with these accidental ceramics. They shipped crate after crate to London, the British Museum's basement filled with what looked like rubble, until George Smith, a banknote engraver with no degree and too much curiosity, began fitting the pieces together under gaslight. Every shard he turned over was still warm with the same fire that had tried to kill it. Tonight, in a quiet gallery behind bulletproof glass, you can stand inches from Tablet 11. Touch is forbidden, but lean close and you can almost smell the smoke trapped inside the clay. The same heat that devoured Nineveh's glory is the reason Gilgamesh's tears reached us at all. The story was murdered and resurrected in a single night of flame. Every great library since, Alexandria, Baghdad, Sarajevo, has burned trying to forget. Every time, a few tablets slip through the inferno and wake up immortal. The words that survive are never the ones kings meant to preserve. They are the ones the fire itself chooses. Gilgamesh begged for permanence on his walls of brick. He never imagined permanence would come wearing the soot of an enemy torch. Close your eyes now, listener. Somewhere in the dark, an ancient library is always burning. And somewhere else, a quiet room is always being filled with its unbreakable ashes. The story keeps dying so it can keep being born, and the smoke still smells of cedar and grief. In the dim basement of the British Museum, November 1872, a 29-year-old engraver named George Smith sits alone under a single gas lamp. His coat is off, his collar undone, his fingers black with ancient soot. He has been matching fragments for months, fitting broken syllables the way a jeweler fits shards of a shattered vase. Tonight he lifts a piece no bigger than a playing card and reads the line that will change everything. The words are in Akkadian, the diplomatic tongue of a dead empire. But Smith knows them by heart now. The hero, Atrahasis, or Utnapishtim, the names blur, is speaking to the gods. A storm is coming, a flood. The man is told to tear down his house and build a boat, take aboard the seed of all living things. Smith's pulse stutters. He has read Genesis 100 times. He knows the cadence of Noah like a hymn. But this tablet was fired centuries before Moses was born. He reads on, faster, lips moving. The boat is sealed with pitch. The flood lasts 6 days and 7 nights. Birds are sent out, dove, swallow, raven. The parallels are so exact, his vision tunnels. When he reaches the line where the gods cowered like dogs at the devastation they themselves unleashed, the room tilts. He stands too quickly, knocking over a stack of trays. Fragments scatter like startled birds. Smith staggers into the corridor, clutching the tablet to his chest. Colleagues find him minutes later, pale and trembling, repeating the same sentence. I am the first man to read this since the world ended. The curator thinks he has gone mad. Smith can barely speak. He has just discovered that the Bible's most famous story is an echo, not an origin. The deluge was remembered in clay a full millennium earlier, and the memory is rawer, stranger, more terrified of the gods than any Sunday school version. 3 weeks later, he stands before the Society of Biblical Archaeology, Prime Minister Gladstone in the front row, and reads the flood tablet aloud. When he reaches the raven that never returns, the room erupts. Grown men weep openly. The Times headline the next morning screams, "Assyrian deluge tablet found, Noah's flood." 1,000 years older than Moses, Smith becomes famous. Overnight, a working-class engraver who outran every Oxford dawn. Yet every night afterward, he returns to the basement alone. He sits beneath the same lamp, running his thumb across the scorched cuneiform, whispering the same question Gilgamesh once whispered on the walls of Uruk. If even the gods were frightened of what they did to us, what chance do the rest of us have? The tablet never answers. It only waits, warm from an ancient fire, for the next pair of trembling hands. The scribes never let us forget the fraction. They carved it into the first lines of the standard version, like a warning tattooed across the hero's chest. Gilgamesh, 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. Not half and half, never a clean split. 2/3 God, 1/3 terror. He was born from Ninsun, the wild cow goddess whose embrace could calm storms, and Lugalbanda, a king already drifting toward legend. From his mother, he took the impossible. Shoulders wide enough to carry mountains, a voice that made lions lie down, beauty so sharp it bruised the eyes. From his father, he took the fatal remainder. Lungs that would one day stop, a heart that would stutter, skin that would wrinkle and tear. 2/3 eternal, 1/3 rot. That fraction was the crack through which every sorrow entered. When he strode through Uruk's markets, people fell silent the way wheat falls before wind. He could outrun antelope, out-wrestle bulls, out-drink any man, until the beer jars wept. Yet every night, he counted his own pulse like a miser counting coins he knew would run out. The citizens felt the imbalance most. Their king was almost a god. Therefore, he could never be merely a king. He took their sons for his labor gangs, their daughters for his bed, their sleep for his endless building projects, because only constant motion kept the 1/3 mortal from catching up. A perfect god would have been distant, serene. A perfect mortal would have been accountable. Gilgamesh was neither. He was the dangerous in-between. Close enough to touch, powerful enough to destroy, fragile enough to dread tomorrow. When Enkidu finally matched him, strength for strength, breath for breath, Gilgamesh wept in the dust of their first embrace. For one shining moment, the fraction balanced. Two almost gods holding each other up, canceling each other's loneliness. Then the gods noticed. They always notice when mortals stop being afraid. So they took Enkidu, slowly, cruelly, letting the illness eat him from the inside while Gilgamesh watched. And in that watching, the fraction reversed. The 2/3 divine crumbled. The 1/3 human swelled until it filled every corridor of his chest. For the first time, he felt the full weight of the mortal third. Small, cold, finite, doomed. He tore off the royal robes, smeared his body with ash, and ran. Not from enemies, there were none left, but from the arithmetic written in his blood. 2/3 God had let him build walls that mocked the horizon. 1/3 human now dragged him toward a grave no wall could keep out. Every step of his later journey was a scream against that fraction. Every monster slain, every ocean crossed, every impossible mile was Gilgamesh trying to renegotiate the original contract. If I prove the 2/3 stronger, will you let the 1/3 live? The gods never answered. They only watched, the way accountants watch a man try to outrun compound interest. And somewhere inside every listener who has ever lain awake counting heartbeats, the same impossible fraction still beats. Almost eternal, almost dust, forever terrified of the remainder. The gods grew tired of the prayers from Uruk, tired of mothers weeping for daughters taken, of fathers limping home from the brick pits. They looked down and saw Gilgamesh striding the palace roof like a storm that had forgotten how to rain. So they decided to give him a mirror. Far out on the steppe, where the grass grows taller than a man, and the only law is hunger, the goddess Aruru pinched a handful of clay, the same red clay that would one day become every ration bowl, and shaped it into a man. She spat once, breathed once, and Enkidu opened his eyes beneath a sky that had never known walls. He was everything Gilgamesh was not. Naked, hairy, fearless, innocent. He drank with gazelles, slept among lions, tore open the traps that snared his four-legged brothers. When hunters from Uruk saw him, they ran back whispering of a wild god who could uproot cedar trees for sport. Gilgamesh heard and smiled the first real smile in years. He sent Shamhat, the sacred harlot of Inanna, with instructions simple and cruel. Tame the wild man. For 6 days and 7 nights, she lay with Enkidu beneath the stars. On the 7th night, he rose, looked at the animals around him, and saw that they were suddenly afraid. The clay had learned shame. The wilderness had lost its sun. He followed Shamhat to Uruk, barefoot, bewildered, wrapped only in her perfume and the new ache in his chest. At the city gate, he met the king. No words, just 2 bodies colliding like planets. They fought in the dust until the doorposts shook and the crowd forgot to breathe. When neither could lift an arm, they knelt, forehead to forehead, and laughed the laugh of recognition. 2 halves of the same impossible creature had finally found each other. From that moment, they were inseparable. Where Gilgamesh burned, Enkidu cooled. Where Enkidu doubted, Gilgamesh dared. They ate from the same bowl, drank from the same cup, slept beneath the same cloak. The people of Uruk watched in wonder as their tyrant learned tenderness. Gilgamesh carrying water for the laborers. Gilgamesh listening instead of commanding. Gilgamesh smiling at children instead of taking them. The gods watched too, and their unease grew. A king who feels is a dangerous thing. A king who loves is worse. So they waited, patient as spiders, for the day the balance would tip and the wild man would have to pay for teaching a tyrant how to be human. But for one brief season, the city breathed easier. 2 almost gods walked its streets hand in hand. And for the first time since the walls rose, Uruk felt less like a cage and more like a heart that had remembered how to beat. The cedar forest lay far to the west, beyond 7 mountain ranges, where the sun goes to die every night. Its trees were older than the flood, taller than any ziggurat, their trunks so thick 20 men linking arms could not embrace one. Their resin smelled of eternity. Gilgamesh wanted them, not for ships or palaces. He wanted to carve his name into something that would never rot. Enkidu tried to warn him. He had drunk from those springs as a wild man. He knew the hush that falls when you step beneath those boughs. Humbaba guards it, he said, voice low. His roar is the flood. His breath is death. Gilgamesh only laughed. The old tyrannical laugh, returning like a cough. Then we will give him something louder to roar about. They left at dawn, two silhouettes against the rising sun, axes bright as accusations. For weeks they marched, sharing bread, sharing silence, sharing the same dream of glory. When they finally reached the forest edge, the cedars closed above them like a second sky. The air grew thick, green, watchful. Birds stopped singing. Even the wind held its breath. Humbaba came at dusk on the seventh day, huge and terrible, his face a map of every nightmare the gods ever had. He did not speak at first. He simply roared, and the roar was the sound of mountains splitting. Trees bent away. Gilgamesh felt his knees loosen for the first time in his life. Then Enkidu stepped forward, placed a steady hand on his brother's shoulder, and roared back. Not with volume, but with something fiercer. Refusal. They fought until moonlight dripped red from the axes. Shamash sent 13 great winds to blind the monster. When Humbaba fell at last, his final breath rattled like a dying world. Gilgamesh raised the axe for the killing stroke, but Enkidu stayed his hand. Let him speak, he said. Humbaba's voice, when it came, was small. You have taken everything. The forest will remember. They cut the tallest cedar anyway. They bound the trunks with ropes of bronze and began the long drag home, singing as men sing when they believe they have conquered fear. The gods listened from their high seats and did not sing. Enlil's face darkened. Anu turned away. In the silence between heartbeats, they passed sentence. One of the pair must pay for the insult to the natural order. Gilgamesh never noticed the mark settle on Enkidu's shoulder that night. Black as cedar resin, shaped like a door that only opens one way. He was too busy counting the trees, measuring immortality in bored feet. The forest, older than sorrow, closed behind them without a sound, already forgetting the names of the men who had wounded it. Only the wind remembered, moving through the stumps they left behind, whispering the same word over and over. Hubris, 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 all the way back to Uruk. They returned to Uruk, dragging cedar trunks thick as temple columns, singing so loudly the walls themselves seemed to echo. Women scattered flowers from the rooftops. Children ran alongside the heroes, touching Enkidu's hairy arm as if it were a talisman. Gilgamesh strode at the front, chest bare, cedar crown on his head, drunk on the smell of resin and victory. He looked, for the first time since Enkidu's arrival, almost happy. Then Ishtar looked down from her temple balcony, and desire struck her like lightning. She leaned over the parapet, breasts framed by lapis lazuli beads, and offered herself in a voice sweet as date wine. Come, Gilgamesh, be my lover. I will give you a chariot of gold and lapis. Kings will kneel, your sheep will bear twins. The city fell silent, waiting for the answer every god already knew. Gilgamesh laughed. Not the warm laugh he saved for Enkidu, but the old cruel one that used to make mothers hide their daughters. He listed her lovers the way a butcher lists cuts of meat. Dumuzi the shepherd, the spotted bird, the lion, the horse she rode, until its heart burst. "You are a gate that lets the wind blow through," he shouted up at her. "I would rather die than be another corpse on your necklace." Ishtar's face turned the color of storm clouds. She flew to her father Anu in heaven and wept until the sky itself shook. "Give me the bull of heaven," she demanded, "or I will break open the gates of the underworld and let the dead outnumber the living." Anu sighed the sigh of every father who has spoiled a child and released the bull. It came down like a falling star with hooves. The earth split the moment it touched ground. 100 young men of Uruk were swallowed in the first tremor. Its breath was drought, its dung poisoned wells. Dust rose until the sun vanished. Gilgamesh and Enkidu ran to meet it, barefoot in the marketplace. Enkidu seized the great horn, Gilgamesh leapt onto its back, and together they danced death across its spine. When the bull finally crashed, the thud was heard in every city between the rivers. The people cheered until their throats bled. They butchered the carcass and feasted for 7 days. Ishtar stood on the wall and cursed them until her voice cracked. And in the quiet council chamber of the gods, Enlil spoke the sentence no one had dared voice since the cedar forest. "One of them has to die." The mark that had settled on Enkidu's shoulder after Humbaba now burned. He felt it that night, lying beside Gilgamesh under a sky suddenly too large. He said nothing. He only pressed closer, as if warmth could bargain with fate. Far above, the gods turned away, already bored with the consequences of their own anger. The bull's blood soaked into the earth of Uruk, and somewhere deep beneath the city something ancient stirred, tasting iron, remembering hunger. The fever came quietly, the way a thief enters a palace he already owns. One morning, Enkidu woke with a heaviness behind his eyes and a taste like copper in his mouth. By noon, he could not lift the cedar-hafted axe that once felled monsters. By nightfall, he lay on a reed mat in the palace's coolest chamber while Gilgamesh knelt beside him, pressing damp cloths to a forehead that burned hotter than any kiln. There was no wound, no poison, no glorious last stand. Only the slow, methodical theft of strength. His legs forgot how to stand. His arms forgot how to embrace. His breath grew shallow, as if even the air had begun to ration itself. The doctors came with rattles and incantations, but the gods had locked their doors. Shamhat wept in the corridor. The palace dogs refused to enter the room, whining at the threshold as though they smelled death already wearing Enkidu's skin. On the 12th night, he could no longer swallow beer. Gilgamesh held his head and begged, voice cracking like a child's. Enkidu managed a cracked smile. "Brother," he whispered, "I am afraid." The words were soft, almost apologetic, as if fear itself were an insult to everything they had been. He dreamed aloud after that. He saw the underworld, a house of dust where the dead sat crowned with dirt, drinking mud, their feathers plucked, their glory forgotten. He cried out that he had become like them already, weak, nameless, light as a bird with broken wings. Gilgamesh tried to hush him, but Enkidu clutched his wrist with the last of his strength and made him listen. When I am gone, he rasped, you will be alone again. Promise me you will not go mad. Gilgamesh promised nothing. He only rocked his dying friend the way a mother rocks a child who will never wake. When the final breath left Enkidu's body, small, almost polite, Gilgamesh did not roar. He simply laid his cheek against the cooling chest and stayed there until the servants feared the king would die too, curled around the corpse like a question mark. Outside, dawn came as it always had, indifferent and bright. Inside, the first man to love another man more than himself discovered what love costs when the gods decide to collect. Enkidu's body was washed, oiled, wrapped in the finest linen, but the palace felt suddenly hollow, as though the walls themselves had exhaled and forgotten how to breathe back in. Gilgamesh rose at last, covered his face with dust, and walked out of Uruk without a word. Behind him, the city mourned a wild man who had taught them gentleness. Ahead of him lay every road that leads nowhere, and the long, terrible education in being mortal. He did not bury Enkidu in the usual way. He dragged the body to the open plain, laid it on a bier of cedar, and kept vigil for 7 days while eagles circled overhead and the wind carried the smell of death across the river. On the 8th morning, he tore his royal robes, let his hair mat with dust, and clothed himself in the hide of a lion he had killed with his bare hands years before. Then he walked out of Uruk without looking back. The gates closed behind him with a sound like a jaw snapping shut. Inside, the city mourned. Outside, the king became a thing neither man nor beast. Barefoot, sunburnt, eyes wild with a grief too large for any palace. He moved like a storm that had forgotten where to reign. Wherever he passed, people fled. Lions followed at a distance, curious about the creature that smelled of both predator and prey. He crossed deserts where the sand burned white at noon and the stars pressed so close he could almost touch them. He drank from brackish pools that would have killed any other man. He slept only when his body collapsed, waking each time with Enkidu's name on his cracked lips. The question that had once been whispered on the walls of Uruk now roared inside his skull. If Enkidu can die, what am I? He was running from the grave, but the grave ran. Inside him, every heartbeat sounded like a footstep catching up. Every shadow looked like the underworld opening its mouth. He beat his chest until blood ran as though pain might bargain with fate. He spoke to the moon, to the wind, to the ghosts of every monster he had ever slain, demanding they tell him where death kept its door. Scorpions the size of dogs guarded mountain passes. He killed them with his hands. A tavern keeper at the edge of the world tried to bar his way. He shattered the door and drank her cellar dry. He crossed seas in boats that should have sunk, walked paths no mortal foot had ever pressed. All the while, the same thought circled like a vulture. Somewhere ahead, there was a man who had survived the flood, a man the gods had made immortal. If Gilgamesh could reach him, could pry the secret loose, then Enkidu's death would become only a pause, a cruel intermission. He did not know the gods were laughing. They had built the world so that every road ends at the same small hole in the ground. But they let him run anyway, because even gods enjoy watching a king learn the shape of his cage. Behind him, Uruk grew small, then vanished. Ahead, the horizon kept opening like a wound that would never close. And still he ran, animal-skinned, mad-eyed, carrying the entire weight of human dread on his shoulders, chasing the one door death had forgotten to lock. The road finally ended at two peaks that touched the sky like scorpion pincers. The mountain of Mashu, where the sun enters every night and emerges every morning, its flanks black glass, its summit lost in cloud. Between the peaks, a gate of bronze stood open, guarded by creatures half man, half scorpion, their tails arched and dripping venom that hissed when it touched stone. They saw the lion skin, the matted hair, the eyes burning with a grief older than language. And for once, they stepped aside. Gilgamesh asked for the road the sun travels when the world sleeps. The scorpion men warned him, no mortal has ever walked it and lived. 12 double hours of absolute darkness, a tunnel that runs beneath the foundations of the world. If he reached the far side before the sun entered behind him, he would live. If not, the light would burn him to ash before he could scream. He did not hesitate. He stepped into the gate, and the darkness swallowed him whole. There was no up, no down, no echo. Only the sound of his own heart and the scrape of his bare feet on stone that felt warm, as though the sun's heat leaked through from somewhere unimaginable. Hours stretched like centuries. He ran until his lungs bled, walked when running failed, crawled when walking failed. The darkness pressed against his eyes until he saw phantom lights. Enkidu's smile, Uruk's walls, the bull of heaven falling in slow motion. He screamed the names of every god he had ever insulted. Bargains, threats, prayers, all swallowed by the tunnel's perfect silence. Time lost its bones. He no longer knew if he had been running for minutes or years. The air grew thick, tasting of iron and distant rain. His skin prickled with the knowledge that something enormous moved behind him. Patient, inevitable, bright as judgment. At the last possible heartbeat, the darkness cracked. A blade of pure gold sliced the black, and Gilgamesh stumbled out into a garden where trees bore jewels for fruit and the sea itself shone like lapis. He fell to his knees, sobbing not from relief, but from the sudden, brutal understanding. He had passed through death's own corridor and come out the other side still breathing. The sun had spared him by the width of a single tear. Behind him, the tunnel sealed without a sound. Ahead lay the jeweled garden, the waters of death, and the one man who had ever walked this road twice. Gilgamesh wiped the blood from his mouth, stood, and kept moving. The darkness had not killed him, but it had taught him its shape. And somewhere inside that shape, Enkidu was waiting. He followed, the scent of warm bread and fermenting dates until he found her. Siduri, the ale-wife of the gods, standing behind a cedar counter at the edge of the jeweled garden. Her tavern was a single round room open to the sky, its walls hung with fishing nets that glimmered like starlight. Beyond the threshold, the sea of death stretched black and endless, lapping at the roots of carnelian trees. Gilgamesh staggered in, looking like something the darkness had chewed and spat out. Lion skin in rags, eyes red from crying, hands still bleeding from the tunnel floor. Siduri took one look and barred the door with her body. "No," she said, voice soft as fresh bread. "You smell of graves and bad decisions. Drink first, then we talk." She poured thick date beer into a clay cup and pushed it across the counter. He drank it in a single pull, then another, then slammed the cup down hard enough to crack it. "I need to cross the waters," he rasped. "Utnapishtim knows the secret. Tell me the way." Siduri studied him the way a mother studies a child who has broken every toy and still demands another. Then she spoke the gentlest, most devastating words ever carved in cuneiform. "Gilgamesh, where are you hurrying? The life you pursue you will never find. When the gods created mankind, they allotted death to mankind, but kept life in their own hands. As for you, fill your belly, make merry day and night. Dance, play, let your clothes be clean, your head washed, bathe in water. Cherish the child who holds your hand, let your wife delight in your embrace. This is the task of mankind." She said it without cruelty, the way one tells a drowning man the river is wider than he thinks. Gilgamesh stood frozen, cup trembling in his fist. For one heartbeat, the tavern smelled only of warm beer and distant flowers, and the sea of death was quiet. He saw it then, Enkidu laughing in the sunlight, Uruk's children running after them with garlands, the simple, terrible beauty of days that end. Then the vision shattered. He hurled the cup against the wall and roared that he would cross the sea anyway, that he would tear immortality from Utnapishtim's throat if he had to. Siduri sighed, wiped her hands on her apron, and pointed to the far shore barely visible on the horizon. "Ur-Shanabi's boat is over there," she said. "But first you will need 300 punting poles, because nothing that touches those waters ever touches them again." She watched him leave, still raging, still running, and shook her head the way every bartender shakes it when the last drunk swears he can handle one more. Behind him, the tavern door swung shut, and the scent of warm bread lingered a moment longer, trying to follow the man who had just refused the only immortality any of us are ever offered. Ur-Shanabi waited on the far shore, like a man who had seen every kind of fool arrive at the edge of the world. His boat was small, black, tar-sealed, and powered by things Gilgamesh had never seen before. The stone charms, smooth basalt figures that leapt into the water and pulled the boat forward as if alive. Ur-Shanabi took one look at the lion-skinned madman dripping with grief and sighed. "You're late," he said, "and you're loud. Sit in the stern and keep your hands off everything." Gilgamesh obeyed for exactly 3 heartbeats. Then the sight of those stone charms moving without oars snapped something inside him. He seized the nearest one, roared, and smashed it against the gunwale. One by one he destroyed them all, hurling the pieces into the black water until the last splash echoed like a death rattle. Silence fell. Even the wind stopped breathing. Ur-Shanabi stared at the wreckage, then at the king. "Do you feel better now?" he asked quietly. Gilgamesh stood panting, fists bleeding, realizing too late what he had done. The ferryman shook his head. Those were the only things that could touch the waters of death without dissolving. Now have 2 choices. Turn back or cut 300 new punting poles, each 60 cubits long, and push us across yourself. 1 pole per push. 1 drop of water on your skin and you become mist. Gilgamesh did not argue. He walked into the forest of jewel trees and began to swing the bronze axe that had once felled Humbaba. For days the sound of chopping rang out like slow thunder. Trees of carnelian and lapis crashed around him, each trunk straight and perfect, each cut a penance, sweat mixed with tears he refused to acknowledge. When the pile reached 300, he bound them into bundles, carried them on shoulders already raw, and loaded the boat in silence. Urshanabi watched without comment. When they finally cast off, Gilgamesh stood in the bow, pushing with one pole after another, discarding each the moment it touched the black water, and began to hiss. 300 times he bent, thrust, straightened, felt his spine scream. 300 times he watched the pole shrink to a glowing stub and vanish. The far shore never seemed to grow closer. Only the bundles grew fewer. On the last pole he looked back and saw Siduri's tavern, a tiny star on the horizon, warm and unreachable. He thought of Enkidu laughing over beer, of children who would never again run after him with garlands. Then he gave the final push, and the boat scraped onto the shore of the immortal. Urshanabi stepped out first. "Welcome to the place no one asked you to reach," he said. And for the first time, his voice held something almost like pity. "Try not to break anything else." The shore was quiet, almost humble. No golden gates, no choirs of angels, just a small reed hut, a low fire, and an old man sitting on a stone bench mending a fishing net. He looked like any grandfather you might pass on the riverbank. Sun-browned skin, white beard, hands scarred from decades of honest work. When he lifted his eyes, Gilgamesh felt the centuries in them, calm, tired, faintly amused. "You are Gilgamesh of Uruk," the old man said, not a question. "You smell of grief and bad decisions. Sit. The tea is almost ready." Gilgamesh fell to his knees in the sand. All the rage that had carried him across deserts, through darkness, over the waters of death, spilled out in a single cracked sentence. "Tell me how to live forever." Utnapishtim studied him the way a man studies a storm that has finally spent itself. Then he poured tea into 2 clay cups, handed one over, and began to speak in the slow, deliberate voice of someone who has forever and no one left to share it with. "I was not always here," he said. "Once I had a city, a wife, children, a name men feared. Shurupak on the Euphrates, older than your Uruk, richer in grain and sorrow. Then the gods decided mankind had grown too loud. Enlil could not sleep for our noise, so they voted to drown us. He spoke of the whisper that came not to him, but to the reed wall of his house. Wall, listen, tear down your house and build a boat. He spoke of 6 days and 7 nights, when the sky fell like a mountain, when even the gods cowered in terror at what they had unleashed. He spoke of the silence afterward, when the only sound was his own heart and the slow drip of water from the roof of the world. When the flood ended, he continued, Enlil was furious that anything breathed, but Enki argued for mercy. So they touched my forehead and my wife's and said, previously Utnapishtim was human. Henceforth he shall be like us. They sent us here, to the mouth of the rivers, where the sun rises on nothing but water and memory. Gilgamesh listened. Fists clenched so tight the cup cracked in his hand. Then give me the secret, he whispered. Make me like you. Utnapishtim smiled, the saddest smile in all literature. There is no secret, child, only a whim of frightened gods who regretted their own cruelty once. Immortality is not a prize. It is a sentence. He gestured at the empty horizon. I have watched every sunrise for longer than mountains remember. My wife died anyway, slowly, of missing the sound of children. I fish. I mend nets. I wait. Forever is a long time to be alone with what you have lost. For the first time since Enkidu's death, Gilgamesh had nothing to say. The fire crackled. Somewhere far away, the waters of death lapped at the edge of the world. Patient, endless, ordinary. Utnapishtim set the broken cup aside and stared into the fire as though it were the past itself burning. Then he began to speak, and the night grew colder. In the year the gods lost their nerve, he said. The sky turned the color of a bruise. Anu drew a line across the heavens and swore the noise of mankind would be silenced forever. Enlil, who could not sleep, stamped his foot, and the earth shook in agreement. Only Enki walked apart, silent, already mourning. At dusk on the first day, the storm arrived without warning. Black clouds rolled in from every horizon at once, swallowing the sun like a mouthful of blood. Then the rain began. Not drops, but ropes. Cables, waterfalls torn loose from the firmament. It hammered roofs until tiles flew like birds. It beat the rivers backward until they climbed their own banks and drowned the fields. By nightfall, Shuruppak was an island in a sea of mud. On the second day, the wind came, a living thing with claws. It ripped palm trees out by the roots and flung them like spears. The noise was beyond screaming. It was the sound of the world tearing its own skin. People clawed at doors that would not open again. Children were lifted from their mother's arms and carried away like leaves. By the fourth day, the flood gods themselves lost control. The dikes of heaven burst. Water fell upward as well as down, as though gravity had forgotten its purpose. The oceans boiled. Steam rose in pillars thick as mountains. The dead floated past with their eyes open, staring at the living who would soon join them. And high above it all, in the highest heaven, the great gods cowered. Ishtar screamed like a woman in childbirth. The Anunnaki huddled together and wept scalding tears that hissed when they struck the earth. Even Enlil, architect of the slaughter, pressed his face to the floor and whimpered like a beaten dog. They had wanted quiet. They got annihilation, and the sound of it terrified them more than any human noise ever had. On the sixth day, the rain thickened into something darker. Mud, blood, pulverized cities. The last mountain vanished. There was only water and the small cube of my boat riding the corpse of the world. Inside, the animals were silent. My wife held my hand so tightly, her nails drew blood. We did not speak. There was nothing left to pray to. On the seventh morning, the storm simply stopped, as if someone had slammed a door. The silence was worse than the roar. The waters lay flat and black, reflecting a sky that had forgotten how to be blue. Everything that had ever lived, except what rocked gently in my ark, had become clay again. Utnapishtim looked at Gilgamesh across the fire. "That," he said quietly, "is what your immortality would have to outrun. Tell me, King of Uruk, are you still in a hurry?" Utnapishtim watched the last ember die between them, then stood and walked to the water's edge. Gilgamesh followed, hollow-eyed, every hope burned to ash. The old man knelt, filled his palm with the dark river, and let it run through his fingers like black sand. "You have crossed the world for nothing," he said, almost kindly. "But my wife has a soft heart. She begs me to give you something anyway." He told Gilgamesh of a plant that grows deep beneath the sweet waters of a distant spring. A plant with thorns like a rose and leaves that glow like moonlight on snow. "It will not make you immortal," he warned, "but it will pull the years from your body like burrs from a cloak. You will be young again once. That is all man has ever been granted." Gilgamesh did not wait for dawn. He tied stones to his feet, took a breath that felt like forgiveness, and sank. The cold closed over him. Down, down, past silver fish and drifting ghosts, until his fingers closed around the glowing plant. He cut it free, kicked upward, and burst into sunlight, gasping, laughing, weeping, all at once. He kept the plant wrapped in wet cloth against his chest the entire journey home. Through deserts, across mountains, past Siduri's tavern that now felt like a dream. He guarded it the way a mother guards a sleeping child. When he finally reached a cool pool near Uruk, exhaustion won. He laid the plant on the bank, stripped off the lion's skin, and slipped into the water to wash away centuries of grief. He closed his eyes for one heartbeat, maybe two. A ripple, a soft hiss. A serpent rose from the reeds, drawn by the strange perfume. It struck once, swallowed the plant whole, and in the same instant shed its skin in a single, shining coil. The snake slid away renewed, scales gleaming like new bronze, while Gilgamesh stood dripping, staring at the empty place where his last hope had been. He did not scream. He simply sat down on the bank and wept the way rain weeps when it realizes the drought has already won. Tears fell into the pool and became part of the same water that had once carried the plant. The snake's discarded skin floated for a moment, perfect, luminous, then sank. When the servants found him at dawn, he was still sitting there, naked, empty-handed, older than any man has a right to be. He looked up at them with eyes that had seen the edge of the world and said only, "Take me home." Behind him, the pool lay quiet, reflecting a sky that had watched the whole sorrowful comedy and would watch it again tomorrow. The plant was gone. Youth was gone. All that remained was the long walk back to Uruk, and the walls that had never once asked why their king returned smaller than he left. Gilgamesh walked home barefoot, the lion's skin long since rotted away, the plant of youth now only a taste of salt on his tongue. When he reached Uruk, the gates opened without trumpet or drum. The people saw their king, thin, gray, eyes like empty wells, and they understood the journey had taken more than it gave. He climbed the great wall at sunset and stood where he once stood with Enkidu. Only now the wind carried no laughter. He looked up at the first stars and finally asked the question he had carried since the Scorpion Gate. Who decided we must die? The answer was written in the sky itself, in the cold, perfect order of the wandering stars and the Sumerians called Anunnaki, those of heaven who came down to earth. Not distant spirits of cloud and thunder, but beings of flesh and calculation who sat in a celestial council chamber that looked suspiciously like a boardroom carved from lapis lazuli. Anu presided, remote as a chairman. Enlil kept the minutes, impatient, allergic to noise. Enki alone voted against most motions, but even he obeyed the majority when it counted. They had created mankind the way a modern company creates a subsidiary, to solve a labor problem. The junior gods, the Igigi, had rebelled after millennia of digging canals and hauling mud bricks. Enlil wanted them punished. Enki proposed a cheaper workforce. They slaughtered one of the rebels, a god named Wei-Ilu who had intelligence, mixed his blood with river clay, and shaped us in assembly line wombs tended by the birth goddess Mami. Our purpose was printed on every cell. Work so the gods can rest. We were never children in their eyes, only assets. Temples were payroll offices. Sacrifices were dividend payments. When the assets grew too numerous and too loud, Enlil moved to liquidate the company. Enki leaked the merger plan to a single shareholder, Utnapishtim, and saved the seed stock. The rest of humanity was written off as a bad quarter. Gilgamesh understood it now. Every wall he had built, every cedar he had stolen, every lover he had taken or refused, had happened inside a cage whose bars were invisible only because they were made of divine accounting. The Anunnaki did not hate us. Hatred would have required interest. They simply managed a resource that had learned to speak, to grieve, to ask why. He looked down at the city sleeping beneath him, 80,000 hearts beating inside a balance sheet, and felt the old rage flicker once, then die. The gods were not cruel. They were owners, and owners do not negotiate with inventory. A small wind moved across the parapet, carrying the scent of river mud and distant rain. Gilgamesh closed his eyes, and for the first time since Enkidu's death, did not fight the night. Somewhere above, the Anunnaki turned another page in their eternal ledger and moved on to the next agenda item, never noticing that one of their assets had finally read the fine print. Gilgamesh stayed on the wall until the sun cleared the horizon and the city stirred beneath him like a beast remembering its chains. Then he did something no scribe ever recorded. He climbed down, walked to the temple of Marduk, and asked the priests to show him the star charts burned into lapis tablets older than Uruk itself. They unrolled the sky before him, constellations drawn as bulls, scorpions, archers. And there, marked with a single red wedge, was the name that would one day terrify millions: Nibiru. The priests spoke softly, the way men speak of a sleeping lion. "It is not a planet," the oldest said. "It is the crossing, the place where the path of the sun, the path of the moon, and the paths of the 5 wanderers all meet once a year at the hinge of heaven. Marduk set it there when he slew Tiamat and ordered the chaos. Nibiru is the ferry, the ford, the still point that keeps every star in its proper furrow. When it stands at zenith on the summer solstice, the calendar is true, the king is legitimate, the gods are content." Gilgamesh traced the red wedge with a trembling finger. He had crossed the world searching for a rogue destroyer, a red planet of vengeance. Instead, he found a celestial traffic light, a quiet policeman of the sky whose only job was to make sure nothing ever wandered off course again. The priests continued. Every 50 years, the pole star itself drifted, and a new star inherited the name Nibiru, the way one priest passes the sacred staff to another. Jupiter had worn it once, then Mercury, then a bright star in the dragon's tail. The name never meant doom. It meant order, balance, the gentle hand on the tiller of time. He laughed then, a sound like pottery breaking. All the terror that had chased him across deserts and under mountains had been a misunderstanding of grammar. The Anunnaki had never needed a planet-sized battering ram. They already owned the quiet point that kept the universe from spinning apart. He left the temple lighter, almost dizzy. The sky above Uruk was the same sky that had watched Enkidu die, the same sky that had refused him the plant of youth. Yet suddenly it felt less like a lid and more like a promise. Somewhere up there, a small red mark moved across the charts every year, unnoticed by anyone except priests and shepherds, making sure the seasons returned, the rivers rose, the barley grew. Gilgamesh looked at his city, 80,000 replacement workers still asleep, and understood at last. The greatest tyranny was not a coming catastrophe. It was the calm, eternal order that never needed to threaten because it never changed. Nibiru was not coming to destroy the world. Nibiru had already arrived centuries ago, and its name was simply Tuesday, Wednesday, harvest, tax, birth, death, sunrise. He climbed back to the wall and greeted the morning like a man who had mistaken a librarian for an assassin. The crossing kept crossing, quietly, faithfully, forever. And humanity kept walking beneath it, heads bowed, carrying the burden. The gods had voted to give us the day the Igigi laid down their shovels. The walls of Uruk still stood when, in 1976, a soft-spoken man in New York pressed print on a manuscript that would detonate louder than any flood. Zechariah Sitchin, raised on Bible stories in Palestine, trained in ancient Hebrew, self-taught in cuneiform, looked at the same tablets Gilgamesh had once stared at and saw something no priest of Marduk ever intended: spaceships. He opened the Enuma Elish and read Tiamat not as primordial chaos, but as a watery superplanet smashed to pieces in a cosmic collision. He read Nibiru not as the quiet crossing point, but as a rogue world on a 3,600-year elliptical orbit. Its inhabitants, the Anunnaki, desperate for gold to repair their dying atmosphere. He read the Igigi revolt and the creation of mankind, and heard not divine labor politics, but an extraterrestrial mining operation gone wrong. The clay that became Adam was Homo erectus upgraded in a test tube by a scientist named Enki. The flood was not divine wrath, but the Antarctic ice sheet sliding into the sea when Nibiru's gravity passed too close. The book hit bookstores like a meteorite. The 12th planet. Cylinder seals that priests saw as stars became radar screens. The 12 great gods became 12 planets. Pluto still counted then, plus the sun and moon. Every myth was suddenly a misremembered press release from an alien colony. Gilgamesh himself became a hybrid prince searching for his Anunnaki relatives. Mainstream scholars howled. Sitchin's translations, they said, were forced, his astronomy impossible. A planet that large on that orbit would have destabilized everything centuries ago. Yet the book sold millions. Overnight, Nibiru stopped being a polite red dot on a Babylonian star chart and became a red Death Star scheduled to swing past Earth again any day now. Gilgamesh, had he been alive in 1976, would have recognized the terror, the same fear that once drove him across. The world in lion skins now lived in late-night radio shows, and grainy photocopies passed hand to hand in university cafeterias. The Anunnaki were no longer distant accountants in the sky. They were gold-hungry astronauts who had never really left, who watched us from the far side of the moon, who had built the pyramids and Stonehenge and still held the lease on human DNA. The quiet crossing point that once promised order now promised collision. The gentle fairy of the heavens became a battering ram. And somewhere in the noise, the original whisper, eat, drink, love, die, was almost forgotten. Yet every time someone opened the 12th planet and felt their pulse quicken, Gilgamesh felt it too, high on his ruined wall, 5,000 years away. Because the question had never changed. If we were made to serve something greater, when is it coming back to collect? Sitchin had simply given the oldest dread a new uniform and a launch date. And humanity, exhausted from carrying the burden since the Igigi strike, lined up to buy the book that told us the shift might finally be over, or just about to get worse. Gilgamesh never knew that the real Nibiru had already come and gone, long before the first brick of Uruk was dreamed of. 12,800 years ago, the Earth was sliding out of its Ice Age winter. Glaciers retreated, forests marched north, and a new kind of human, taller, cleverer, painting caves with star maps, hunted mammoths across a green North America. Then, in a single afternoon, the sky caught fire. Fragments of a disintegrating comet, some the size of cities, rained down in a glowing arc from the Great Lakes to the North Sea. They struck the ice sheet at 20 times the speed of sound. In seconds, 2 million square kilometers of ice flashed into superheated steam. Shock waves flattened forests for 1,000 kilometers. Trillion-degree firestorms sucked the air from lungs and painted the stratosphere black with soot. Temperatures in the north plunged 15 degrees overnight. The Younger Dryas had begun. Where the fragments hit, the ground itself melted into glass. Nanodiamonds, harder than any earthly stone, condensed from the carbon of vaporized trees. A razor-thin black mat of charcoal and iridium spread across 4 continents like a funeral shroud. Beneath it, the bones of mammoths, saber-tooths, giant sloths, all snapped and scorched as if flash-frozen mid-scream. Above it, nothing. The megafauna were gone in a heartbeat. The Clovis hunters vanished from the record the same week. Then came the meltwater. A quadrillion gallons of ice water roared into the Atlantic, shutting down the ocean conveyor. Europe froze while the South burned. Sea levels jumped 10 meters in months. Coastal civilizations, if any existed, were erased so cleanly we still argue whether they were ever there. For 200 years the planet staggered. Droughts, megafloods, centuries of winter and summer. When the dust finally settled, the survivors told stories of a time when the sky fell, when fire and ice traded places, when the gods tried to kill the world and only just failed. Those stories became Gilgamesh's flood, Noah's flood, Deucalion's flood, Manu's flood, 500 versions whispered around campfires that still smelled of smoke older than memory. The black mat became the biblical pitch. The nano-demons became the rainbow promise. The comet became the angry god, or the passing planet, or the serpent that stole the plant of youth. Standing on his wall, Gilgamesh felt the tremor of that ancient impact in his bones without knowing why. Every culture that crawled out of the Younger Dryas carried the same scar. A terror that the sky might fall again, that the order we call civilization is only a brief pause between catastrophes. The Anunnaki never needed a returning planet. They had already sent their messenger once, a silent swarm of fire and ice that rewrote the world in a single afternoon. And somewhere in the black mat beneath our feet, the receipt is still warm. The black mat cooled. The ice returned for 1,000 cruel years, then retreated again. And when the sun finally came back for good, strange men and women appeared at the edges of the hunter-gatherer camps. They arrived alone or in pairs, bearded, cloaked in hides no local animal had ever worn, carrying seeds of wheat and barley in leather pouches and knowledge that should have taken centuries to earn. They spoke little, but what they said changed everything. They showed frightened bands how to plant instead of chase, how to stack mud bricks into walls that laughed at wind, how to read the moon's face and predict the river's temper. They drew perfect circles on the ground and said, "Here will stand a city." Then they walked on, leaving the circle to fill itself with people. We call them the Apkallu and Sumer, the 7 sages, fish-tailed wise men who rose from the sea after the flood to teach writing, law, and plowing. In India, they were the Saptarishi. In Egypt, followers of Thoth. In Mesoamerica, the bearded stranger Quetzalcoatl. Same story, different accent. Survivors who carried the memory of a world that had known cities before the sky fell. Were they refugees from a drowned Ice Age civilization, fleeing inland as the seas rose 100 meters in their grandparents' lifetime? Did they watch their own Uruk equivalent slide beneath black water, clutching only the most portable treasures, seed corn, star maps, the secret of bronze? Or were they simply the cleverest farmers who happened to be in the right valley when the climate finally turned kind again, and memory made gods of them? Göbekli Tepe whispers the first answer. 11,600 years ago, while the younger Dryas still gnawed the north, someone in southern Turkey raised 20-ton T-shaped pillars into perfect circles, carved them with foxes, scorpions, and warning hands, then deliberately buried the whole complex under a hill of their own, rubble. A message, a library sealed against the next flood. The hunters who built it had no villages, no pottery, no crops, yet they moved stones heavier than anything Gilgamesh ever lifted. Then they vanished, leaving the hill like a time capsule addressed to whoever came after the ice. Gilgamesh met their echo in the antediluvian kings of the Sumerian list. Alulim, who reigned 800 years, Alulgar, Enmenlu-Ana. Names too long for human tongues, reigns too long for human hearts, yet written in the same ink as his own 126 years. They were the ones who taught the post-flood children how to begin again. They were the reason writing appeared suddenly, fully formed, like a gift left on the doorstep after the storm. He understood now, standing on the wall at dusk. The seed of civilization was not invented in Uruk. It was carried there, terrified and wet, by people who had already watched the world end once and were determined it would not end twice. Every brick he laid, every ration, bowl, every cuneiform sign was a thank you note to ghosts who never asked for thanks. The survivors kept walking, and the world kept following. Long before Uruk, before even the first barley field, a low hill rose in what is now southern Turkey. The people who came there had no villages, no chiefs, no pots. They hunted gazelle with flint-tipped spears and followed the great herds across a world still shaking off the younger Dryas frost. Yet one morning they began to dig. They quarried limestone bedrock with stone picks, shaped T-shaped pillars taller than 2 men and heavier than 20 mammoths. They dragged them upright into perfect circles, 20, 30, 40 pillars in each ring, facing inward like silent judges. They carved the stone with life. Foxes leaping, scorpions poised, vultures tearing at headless men, hands raised as if to say stop. On one pillar, a comet streaks across the sky, its tail split into 13 rays. The exact number of fragments scientists now count in the Younger Dryas impact swarm. They worked for generations, building enclosure after enclosure, each more precise than the last. Then, when the carvings were finished and the circles complete, they did the strangest thing of all. They buried everything. They hauled thousands of tons of earth and rubble, filled every ring to the brim, and walked away. No bodies, no offerings, no trace of daily life. Just the temples and the deliberate grave. 11,600 years later, when Klaus Schmidt brushed the dirt from the first T-pillar in 1994, the world gasped. These were supposed to be primitive hunter-gatherers. Yet here was architecture that demanded astronomers, engineers, a calendar, and a reason strong enough to move mountains of stone and then hide them forever. Gilgamesh never saw Göbekli Tepe, but he would have recognized the terror carved into its pillars. The same sky that once fell, the same warning that the gods, or the cosmos, can wipe the board clean whenever they tire of the game. The people who built it had no writing, so they wrote in 20-ton sentences and signed them with comets. Then they buried the book so the next children would have to dig for the lesson. They were telling us what the survivors told every generation after the flood. Remember what happened. Remember that civilization is not a birthright. It is a loan. Remember that the sky can fall again. And when it does, the only thing that survives is what we choose to bury deep enough. Gilgamesh felt the message in his bones without ever touching the stone. Every wall he raised, every tablet he ordered pressed into wet clay, was his own Göbekli Tepe, a desperate attempt to shout across the next catastrophe. I was here. I loved, I lost. Do not forget us when the fire comes again. The hill in Turkey still keeps its secret. The pillars wait beneath the wheat, patient as sleeping gods, ready for the next pair of trembling hands to uncover the oldest sentence humanity ever wrote. We survived once. Try to deserve it. Gilgamesh came down from the wall one last time. The city was quiet. Even the dogs had stopped barking. He walked through the empty streets to the scribal quarter, past the sleeping apprentices, until he reached the oldest tablet rack in the Eanna temple. Moonlight fell through a high window and lit a single shelf of broken fragments no one had catalogued since the days of the Flood Kings. He lifted one shard no larger than his palm. It looked ordinary. A list of barley rations, a date, a royal seal. But at the bottom, pressed lightly, almost playfully, into the wet clay thousands of years ago, was a sign the scribes never explained. A tiny 8-pointed star inside a circle, the symbol for God, followed by the sign for house, followed by the sign for man. Together they read, in the most literal translation possible, God House Man, or more freely, the gods moved in with us. He found the same mark on 37 other tablets scattered through the archives. On the Sumerian king list beside the antediluvian rains, on the Tumul inscription beside his own name, on the flood story beside Utnapishtim's boat. Always small, always in the margin, always ignored. A graffiti tag left by someone who knew the shelves would outlast every empire. Gilgamesh stood in the moonlight, holding the shard, and felt the years collapse. The Anunnaki had never returned to Nibiru. They had simply stepped down from their thrones, shed the radiance that hurt human eyes, and walked among the replacement workers they once voted to drown. Some became the Apkallu sages who taught writing and plowing. Some married into the bloodlines of the first cities. Some simply waited, patient as DNA, for the long game to play itself out. He thought of his own mother Ninsun, Lady Wild Cow, whose embrace calmed storms and whose eyes sometimes looked older than the rivers. He thought of the impossible longevity in his own veins, 126, years when most men crumbled at 50. 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. The fraction was never a metaphor. It was a receipt. Outside, the first hint of dawn touched the ziggurat. Gilgamesh placed the shard back on the shelf exactly where he found it, for the next pair of trembling hands. Then he walked to the great gate, laid his palm against the warm brick one final time, and spoke aloud the sentence the tablets had been trying to whisper since the first fire hardened them. They never left. They just changed their address. The wind carried the words up the wall, over the rooftops, into the waking sky, where a small red crossing point still moved faithfully across the heavens, keeping time for a species that had never been alone. Gilgamesh smiled, small, tired, almost peaceful, and went home to die. Good night.